Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. The 2021 federal budget introduced a universal daycare system into Canada. The government declared an investment of $27.2 billion over the next 5 years on a Canada-wide childcare plan and $8 billion thereafter to maintain it. This hopes to allow every Canadian to access affordable daycare across the nation at an average cost to families of $10 a day. Provinces, one by one, developed a program, if they didn't already have one, that is, tailored for their own province to qualify for this new federal funding. Ontario was the lone holdout until today. In March 2022, Ontario announced its program for universal daycare, and some parents are already thrilled for this financial relief. In Toronto, for example, the average cost for daycare is $20,000 and can be more expensive than a year of university tuition. However, some parents are also disappointed that their own daycare choices will not qualify for funding. For example, if you're a parent choosing to stay at home with your child, you do not qualify. Ditto if you're a grandparent or a relative who helps out. Only institutionalized daycare settings are eligible for this funding. But is this the right approach? What about families who opt for a different model than a government-run daycare? Will they be paying more for something they won't use? Does this help or hinder choice? Will a one-size-fits-all program leave many families left out? Will a universal daycare give more decision-making power to the government on how your child is cared for? Later in the program, I'll be joined by Kerry McCuaig, Fellow in Early Childhood Policy at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. But joining me now is Andrea Mrozek, Senior Fellow of Cardus. Andrea, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's just start off the bat. Does the Ontario program hit the mark?
No, it doesn't. It's actually a little bit worse than what you described. It's access only to licensed care. The vast majority of Ontario parents are not using licensed care. So it is a minority of parents who will be angling for these $10 a day spots. And as is widely acknowledged by those who love the system or people like me who dislike this approach, it's widely acknowledged it'll distort demand. So more people will be attracted to the licensed $10 a day spots. And they will not be able to find spaces because the amount of money, though consequential in the billions, is not enough to create those spaces. So the most recent federal budget actually allocated more millions of dollars in recognition of the fact that the program is already underfunded and it hasn't quite started yet, or it's just getting off the ground, as you pointed out, with Ontario signing on.
So in Ontario, if you said like the majority of parents are sending their children to, or there are many parents who are sending their children to unlicensed daycare spaces, would that just not prompt more daycares to be licensed then? And then that would fulfill demand?
No, so I'm on, actually, as the mother of a 3-year-old, I'm on a lot of mommy Facebook groups, et cetera, a lot of parents trying to figure out what this new deal means in Ontario, and then unlicensed operators chiming in as to why they will not be becoming licensed. There's a lot of good reasons for that. As they will always point out, unlicensed does not mean illegal. Some cases, they actually have higher quality standards. They don't want to take as many children as are permitted in licensed care. They'd like to be able to choose how much time they spend outside, for example, and make up their own sort of programs for their kids. I actually think they have a higher interaction with parents. So it's typically home-based care that is unlicensed. And a lot of those operators have a lot of good reasons for not joining. And so what we're seeing is a lot of them saying they'll get out of the business if they are compelled to join. And that's why you'll see a decrease in choice for parents as some of these operators decide not to continue in the business. And that is a point of fact in British Columbia for sure, where operators are frankly being pushed out. To not have private care in the system was actually, I think, a point of it. They don't want private care. They claim it's lesser quality for spurious reasons. And so it's actually part of the plan is to decrease the choices for Ontario parents and Canadian parents.
Well, so that this is very disturbing to me because I'm one of the probably many Canadians who don't believe the government knows best for my children. I, as the mummy, know best for my children. There's a lot to discuss here and more to unpack, and we'll be with you in just a few moments after this commercial break. Welcome back. We're discussing Ontario's newly revealed Universal Daycare plan, which will be funded in part or mostly by the federal government. And joining me is Andrea Mrozek, Senior Fellow of Cardus. Andrea, before the break, we were discussing how only licensed daycare operators would be funded. And you brought up a very interesting point. That would close the door to a lot of choice parents presently in Ontario enjoy as to where they want their child supervised, or having the choice to say, okay, I want my child daycare here, or maybe I want to do it myself. So can you discuss a little bit more? And I think that it comes down to parental rights and parental choice. How does something like a universal daycare system undermine parental choice and parental rights?
I think what it does is create that incentive to join the government system. And that isn't another choice among many, as is so often claimed. If you put that much money into something, it becomes a tempting proposition. And it furthermore gets the seal of approval, as it were, from the government. And that leads parents to believe that it's better quality. We talked about home-based unlicensed care before the break. A lot of these providers have fewer children in their care and provide a more intimate setting that is a choice for many parents. They prefer it. But as we move into this early learning plan, I'd be prepared to see more rhetoric around how many benefits are associated with the system. And the defense will come in to, it creates pressure from governments to suggest that this is the best way to go, which frankly, parents have already felt as things have gone with talk of early learning. It's just a one-sided view, and a lot of parents are making different choices. And it pains me, frankly, to think about all of the shift workers and lower income, disadvantaged parents who will not have the time to advocate for their families in the way that some other people will, to get those spaces at the cheaper cost.
My goodness.
That's something we've seen in Quebec too. I'm not making these stories up. The concern is very real that we are going to be giving spaces at a lower cost to the families who would need it least.
Wow, that's really sounds like a tragedy in the making, because we'll be creating an artificial demand for fewer spots. That's pretty crazy. When we think about the impetus that perhaps was behind bringing in a program like this, some suggested, well, generally speaking, the responsibility of child rearing and child minding falls to the mother. We want to get more women in the workspace. We want to see economic growth, increased rate of women in the workspace, as I said. And again, long-term socioeconomic success for children. They get in earlier, learn earlier. Is there any weight to any of these things? I mean, they sound so lovely, but first of all, is there a problem already? And is this the right way to fix it?
Well, I'll just tackle one angle of what you raised in the question there, is this idea of getting women into the workforce. As has been pointed out it's been pointed out many times that there's been advocacy for this for 50 years. 50 years ago was a very different reality with regards to women's labor force participation. And we have seen it rise and rise and rise to levels that frankly are quite higher than many other developed nations. And so the question is, how many more mothers of young children are we going to compel into the workforce? And I use the word compel because when you create that financial incentive, you're pushing people in a particular direction, putting weight on the scales of the choice, as it were. So we already have this high labor force participation. We're supposedly going to be accruing the benefits of even more mothers of young children in the workforce from this, but we've just discussed the space shortages that are very likely happening as we speak. So it's doubtful to me that we'll see that benefit in the bottom line that the Canadian government is aiming for. They put it forward as a feminist policy. They push women who work in their own private businesses out of their businesses, courtesy of not funding unlicensed care. And then they hope for this additional tax, reaping some additional tax benefit from getting more women working. And that's something I really would love to see economists put their heads to and start studying it and laying the groundwork for that study, because I think the benefits on that front are going to be minimal.
Right. I think your point was well taken, that this isn't the same environment as it was 50 years ago or even 70 years ago.
It's a very different environment. And you have so many, myself included, mother of a of a toddler, making choices around work that don't fall into those buckets of stay at home, so-called, versus working.
Well, especially in the last 2 years, we've seen with working from home, things have become so dynamic, things have become more flexible.
Yeah, and we know from statistics and polling that the vast majority of mothers of young children prefer to work part-time. Another thing that concerns me around this is it does push toward full-time work, which is how you get the economic benefits supposedly at the other end.
Okay, well, we got to pause there because we run out of time. But Andrea, we'll have you back on and we'll see how this works in the rollout. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the newly released Ontario Universal Daycare Plan. And joining me is Kerry McCuaig, Fellow in Early Childhood Policy at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. Kerry, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Excellent. So, as an overview, does the Ontario Plan hit the mark?
The Ontario Plan is slow in a number of ways. We were the last to sign on, and that we were told that this was because Ontario would get a unique deal. In fact, Ontario was getting no more than every other province has received. And the downside of that is that, well, parents across the country are already enjoying lower childcare fees. Parents in Ontario are still waiting to get that cut in fees. The other missing ingredient is enough coverage. There are 71,000 new spaces that are promised over the next 5 years. That is the lowest expansion in childcare spaces that we've seen in over a decade. So we have all this new money from the federal government, yet we're ramping up access at an even slower rate. So we're only going to have about enough spaces at the end of this for about 43,000 kids. 43% of of Ontario's children 0 to 5, and that is far below what every other jurisdiction is doing. Quite frankly, other jurisdictions are trying to hit the 60-70% mark in terms of coverage, and here in Ontario, we're satisfied with 43% of kids.
So for families who want to choose to join this program where they can enjoy the $10 a day daycare, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there simply isn't enough space to fulfill the demand for this affordable daycare.
Absolutely. So if you're a parent who's already using childcare and you can see these, your cut in fees coming down the line, you've kind of won the lottery. But if you're outside the childcare system, you're no closer to getting in than you ever were before. And even, before this deal was announced and parents were paying, up to $2,000 a month for an infant space, we had long lineups for care. Right. So you can really imagine that as the cost of care goes down, more and more parents will want that option for their children, but it won't be available for them.
Now, one key component of this plan, the Ontario plan, is it only applies to institutional, or shall we say, regulated, licensed daycare. Sorry, I lost the word there for a moment. Mm-hmm. But there are many, many other unlicensed daycare operators, some of these at home where they might have 3 or 4 children in the neighborhood, something like that. Is there an expectation that at some point the money to increase space would flow through to some of these childcare providers, or is really the focus more to channeled into more institutional settings?
Well, there is part of who is covered under the agreement are home childcare providers that are regulated. Like these are usually providers that are connected to an agency, and that agency provides them with, with a whole range of supports, in addition to overseeing the quality of care that's taking place in the home. So it provides parents with some sort of assurance that their kids are in safe settings. So I think that the thought going down is that these providers would join into the regulated care sector in order to advantage their parents with lower fees.
Okay, because yes, I mentioned this to a previous guest that with the announcement of this program, it sounds like a bubble will be created where a lot of folks will want to jump in to get obviously the daycare spots with lower fees. But there's not enough space to fulfill the demand, and now we're creating an artificial demand, really.
Right. Well, when we look across the board at all forms of childcare that parents use, there's not enough. There's not enough in the informal sector. There's not enough in the formal sector. So what we find parents doing, in fact, the biggest form of childcare is mom works days and dad works afternoons or evenings. And that works for some families, but you can also imagine it's like serial single parenting. It
Right.
puts a lot of stress on family life.
Well, and forces some to choose shift work, which maybe that's not what they prefer, and it reduces sometimes parental choice in that matter. And especially, we've maybe enjoyed, for lack of a better word, a lot of more flexibility with our work arrangements for some Ontarians.
Right.
But that sounds like it's coming to an end, so things might go back to the old normal versus the new one. Anyhow, we're going to unpack more of this in just a few moments after our break. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the newly revealed Ontario Universal Daycare Plan. And joining me again is Kerry McCuaig. Kerry, before the commercial break, we were discussing sort of the user end of what this program could mean for parents who use childcare. What about those who provide childcare? What about those in the workforce of the childcare workforce? How is this policy being received by them?
There is a lot of disappointment. This is a sector that it's very hard to encourage people to enter it. And then once they're in, it's very difficult to get them to stay. The turnover in the early childhood workforce is about 30% every year. And that has impacts on the children in care. Because a big part of quality care is there's an attachment between the caregiver and the child. And when there's that turnover all the time, it absolutely, impacts on the quality of care that kids receive. But Ontario has said that it will only boost the compensation of educators who are making under $18 an hour. And that excludes the majority of childcare providers in the province. I mean, I think it's appalling that anybody would be required to do this important work for so little pay.
Sure.
But when we look at what Ontario is doing to enforce, to encourage its childcare workforce to come in and to stay. They're topping up wages at about $2 an hour. And let's compare this to the Yukon, which tops up wages by $17 an hour, New Brunswick by $12 an hour, the Northwest Territories by 10. You go on and on. And Ontario is absolutely the least generous to its workforce of any other jurisdiction. And the point is, even though its expansion plans are modest, it's, you can build childcare, but if you don't have the people to staff it, there's not much advantage. And there's really a lot of hurt within the sector, because when you think of it, when COVID was called, it was childcare workers who were also on the front lines. They were the ones who stepped up to look after the children of frontline, healthcare workers and others. And they didn't get the bonus pay. They weren't first in line for protective equipment. They weren't prioritized for vaccines.
And they were working around the clock in some cases.
They were providing 24-hour care, right? And so they did this. Now there's this federal windfall that's come to Ontario, And they're not even being acknowledged for the work that they, for the sacrifices that they made to get us through the pandemic, and going forward. I mean, I think everybody in Ontario, particularly as we kept being told, we're going to hold out for a better deal. Ontario is going to get the best deal, et cetera, et cetera. And then it comes down, and there's really next to no accommodation for the workforce. And it's so, we hear about the tired and demoralized healthcare worker. Mm-hmm. We really need to pay some attention to the demoralized childcare worker, because
that's a very good perspective, and I think one that I agree with, that often gets overlooked in this discussion. Mm-hmm. I'm going to bring it back to the parental perspective for a moment, because I'm a mom. I've got 5 kids working. It's always a juggle. Mm-hmm. But my concern is how, and we only have about 45 seconds left, is what about parents who stay home? Who've made that financial decision for their family? They're not going to be getting any money in this program. How do we meet their needs for childcare, or other families who may outsource it to family members, because they're not institutionalized, so they won't get the money?
So those families are covered under the childcare benefit plan. I mean, this is a program. I mean, and they're quite upfront about it. It's a program to allow mainly mothers to be part of the workforce. Canada is facing a huge workforce crisis, and it's going to need all hands on deck. Okay. So this is an encouragement to get women into the workforce.
Okay. Well, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining me again, and we'll have you on again in the future when we discuss this. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Well, it seems to me there are many concerns and complaints around this new Ontario childcare plan, but one concern that I have as a parent is, what is this going to do for choice for parents who don't opt into an institutional setting? There won't be any money for them. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.